Hello, welcome everybody.
Hello.
Really good to have you in this session. Take a moment to orient yourself, have a look who else is in the room. You might want to enable the participant panel so that you can see the other names, and then also the chat window. Please feel free to enable that too so that you're able to dialogue with us this evening. My name's Jessica Bockler. I'm one of the co-founding directors of the Aleph Trust, and I welcome you to this session, which is part of the Corona and Beyond series of dialogues that we've been hosting over the summer with members of our faculty. And today we're welcoming Jevon Dangeli, who is a colleague, a collaborator, co-creator of our master's program in transpersonal psychology, consciousness studies and spirituality. And I want to tell you a little bit about Jevon this evening before we get going. And then I want to pass the ball over to you for a moment to consider what questions are you sitting with as you're joining this session. So Jevon is an NLP trainer, a transpersonal coach and a hypnotherapist. And he has written many manuals and created many audio and video programs teaching transformative methods. And he's really carved out a niche for himself in the area of coaching and combining coaching with transpersonal perspectives, infusing them with the spiritual, with the transpersonal. And Jevon is a co-founder of the International Association of Coaches, Therapists and Mentors. And this includes a foundation that aims to provide humanitarian aid volunteers with free educational resources and support. And Jevon is particularly interested in the value of mindfulness-based practice for people who are experiencing chronic stress and burnout. And I think you would agree with me that those sorts of areas couldn't be any more relevant today, as we're all facing these extraordinary, unusual circumstances that are going on for a prolonged period of time. The new normal, as some of us now call it. But what is normal? Everything has been turned upside down for so many of us. And we're adjusting, we're trying to orient ourselves. And many of us are trying to navigate these times with a lot of a sense of stress, anxiety, uncertainty. So in this session today, we want to reflect on mindfulness-based approaches, awareness practices that can help us navigate these times of uncertainty. And I want to invite you in to connect with yourself, sense into the body, into the whole of you, to connect to the breath, just for a moment, attuning, arriving together. And then noticing what questions arise as you're paying attention more deeply. So just take a moment with me and adjust your posture. Place your feet firmly on the ground. Maybe you want to close your eyes for a moment. And allow the body to settle into the chair or couch. Allowing the shoulders to soften. Maybe you can bring your spine into greater vertical alignment. Feeling the feet on the ground. To feel the contact that you have with the chair, the couch, maybe the floor. Kindly looking inward, arriving home to yourself. And as you're doing so, take a moment to observe the flow of the breath. coming home. Softening. And just allow awareness to softly expand outward, feeling into the whole of you, arriving here. Present with yourself, present to the space that you find yourself in, and present to our shared space here in the Zoom platform. And from this place of heightened awareness, notice what arises for you. Is there a question that you're sitting with? An intention? A thought? What has brought you here today into this space? And just allow your eyes to open softly. Again, reorient towards the screen, staying alive to what is present, what is happening inside. And find the chat window and feel free to write something there about what is bringing you here today. Maybe there's a question, a couple of sentences you want to say. So feel free to post these right now. So we're going to just give you a moment to type away. So keep on typing. Just want to acknowledge what Nancy has posted. My own interest with burnout, and especially over these changing times. Where are we heading? It's my interest for my dissertation. Thank you for sharing that, Nancy. I sit with the multiplicity and the complexity of what's unfolding. How can we navigate that? How can we not be overwhelmed by that? How can we find our own way? Henny is writing, what is the nature of deep and balanced intent with purpose and manifestation? Thank you, Henny. And Peter, hello from Kenya. Hello, Peter. Good to have you back. Looking forward to learning more about ecologic and how it is changing. So keep these comments coming. And I'd like to hand over to Les and of course Jevon to explore, begin to weave the narrative together. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, and hello to everyone, and of course welcome to Jevon. So Jevon, you've seen some questions that are coming in the chat window there. I always like to open, kind of take you back to your title, because obviously, you know, everyone is giving one of these sessions, we give you the choice of a title, and the title must obviously reflect where your interest lies. So I think that point about perspectives is really very important, and I'm sure we'll come to that. But let's, since Nancy was first over the threshold, as it were, and all credit to her for going first, I wonder if we might start with what she questions there, which is about burnout in the kind of changing times we're living in. Do you see any evidence that burnout is worse in the current climate? And that's part of the question I'll put to you. But also, I think we can also link it, hopefully we can do this in a clever way, link it to the title, i.e. your point about perspectives. Is that important when we come to think about burnout? So an opening for you there.
Thank you, Les. Thank you, Nancy, for the question. Thank you to Aleph Trust for hosting me this evening. So, several questions flying in right from the start. These are great questions. Let's see how I can respond. Burnout. Well, Nancy knows that I have a particular interest in exploring burnout, and it was the topic of my research done through Aleph Trust. And what I was curious about was not only what burnout is and how it is affecting people today. That research which I'm referring to was done a number of years ago, but rather in how a particular perspective plays a role in promoting burnout. So a particular perspective that gets us thinking, feeling, and behaving in certain ways that plays a role in why we might tend to burn out, which is a different stance from what other researchers have explored in burnout studies. These being that burnout is typically when we overexert ourselves for too much time with too little return in terms of self-care and in terms of care from others. And eventually we're depleted, we've run out, and we're flat on our backs. And very simply put, burnout might be described as that sometimes. And whilst that remains reasonable and valid today as it was before, I think we can also consider that burnout goes further than that, and that this perspective which I'm referring to is one in which we as individuals feel very isolated. You could say cut off from each other, cut off from nature, cut off from our sources of inspiration and aliveness and energy through that particular perspective. And in these cut off ways of being, this contrived mode of thinking and operating in the world, we're not accessing our whole selves. We're not accessing all the energy that could be available to us. And that then is definitely a factor. So I'm referring to a sense of separateness, a sense of being a separate individual self operating alone in the world. Whilst we might be around family, friends, and colleagues, we don't feel a deep sense of connection to them. We're not connecting from one soul to another, you could say. Furthermore, we might not feel a deep sense of connection to the environment, to the natural world, to the ecosystem that we are an integral part of. And with that sense of separation pervading, we then run out of these ways of operating optimally. So now might in fact be a good time to refer to the single slide that I have brought to today's session to highlight this point.
As the slide's coming up, it's not quite on screen yet, I think. Yeah, it's coming now. Let me just add in a point for you to bear in mind when you're talking about separation. Would you agree that, you know, and in the West in particular, you know, we're moving out of a period, an epoch, when really the emphasis was on the individual, and maybe things are changing in that aspect. But I'll leave you to talk about this slide. It looks interesting.
Thank you for that. Well, I'd love to think that we are moving out of that era of being self-centered and self-focused. and operating on the ego's terms. And in fact, I might even extend that one step further and say that we collectively as a society have been operating in that mode for too long. And that perhaps that way of being in the world, which I call the ego logic perspective, cut off from each other, cut off from nature, plowing on, taking care of our financial interests and the interests of our own tribe or population, but with disregard to others and to the environment that we all share. That this era is hopefully, perhaps even through the onset of the pandemic, showing up in a way that we can reflect on. Perhaps we've been out of alignment, perhaps we've been out of touch with what is possible for us individually and collectively. And perhaps we're burning out because we're not tapping into these sources of energy that could be available to us. So on the slide, which you're looking at, in the left-hand diagram there, tunnel awareness depicts this narrowed mode of perception in which we are fixated on issues, goals, particular outcomes that appeal to the ego. Me, myself, and I. What do I want? What do I want for my family, or what do I want for just my population with disregard to others? These are ego-based desires, and whilst we pursue them with all our energy focused on that particular outcome, we are disregarding everything else that could be present in the periphery of our awareness. By learning the skill of opening the aperture of awareness, we can, through this open awareness, access what I'd like to refer to today as the eco is important here, logical perspective. So the logic that might occur to us in terms of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors when we are more connected in ourselves. So what we've got in the right-hand diagram here are three aspects of what the open awareness perspective promotes, with one being introspective. So open awareness supports us in being more mindful of our mental activities, our emotions, our somatic experience. We're more aware of that part of the self, as well as outrospection, which could be defined as an awareness of others and the ways in which we relate to others around us, the space that connects us to them. So that part of open awareness is others-oriented. And then invirospection is that deep sense of being part of a greater whole, of the environment, of the ecosystem, of the organization, and of the cosmos. So open awareness as a practice, I'm referring to a particular technique here, enables one to cultivate these three aspects, which are self, others, and environment oriented. And I like to think of that as the win-win-win focus. You know? Our actions are motivated to take care of ourselves, take care of others, and take care of the world that we share. So that's why I'd go so far as to propose that if we could engage in practices that promote this ecological perspective, we may find ourselves individually and in the groups with which we collaborate, operating on those terms. What I have found, just to close on that, what I have found is that through being in open awareness, there's an ease and a flow in terms of how we operate, in terms of how we experience ourselves, others, and the world around us. This ease and flow enables us to be, you could say, at the top of our game and ecological at the same time. Therefore, open awareness, through my research now, if I may point to that, has shown to help prevent burnout and even support clients in burnout treatment when they're undergoing treatment. So
thank you,
there's great value in the technique.
Thank you, Jevon. And it sounds like, well, I'll just quote you, win, win, win. We can't ask much more than that. I'd like to ask you to say more about open awareness, and especially the practice thereof, but I'm going to hold back on that. I'm sure we'll come to that. I am aware that there's material in the chat window, and I think I'd like to get that participatory sense. So I'm very keen on what people are saying to bring that in. So if you can bear with it on that way. And I'm looking at what Cal has written, and you probably see it yourself, but I'm going to read it out to you. She says, sensing the polarization of self-sovereignty in the midst of collective and media-induced fear, how can open awareness orientate us within aligned sovereignty of true self?
That's a really profound question.
Yeah, that's why I thought I'd go to it. and I'm in the nice position, I don't have to answer it, I can just ask it.
Okay then, I'll
Over
give it
to
my
you,
best
Jevon.
shot. I think it might come down to how one defines the self. Mm-hmm. So the sovereign self, what are we referring to? Because we could just as well talk about taking care of ourselves, and as a result of that, coping better in the current climate of what is prevailing around us. And that would be true. But if we take care of ourselves with disregard to others and the environment, then there's something about the win-win-win formula that's just not there. And taking care of ourselves with disregard to others jeopardizes our relationships, jeopardizes our sense of deeper connection to others and to the world around us. When cultivated, the sense of self expands through the practice of open awareness. And then, what we're loyal to is a commitment to care for ourselves, care for others, and care for the environment. So in this instance, our actions are more conscious, more mindful. We're at the top of our game, but we're doing so in a conscious manner that is beneficial to the world around us. But more than that, it's developing this deeper sense of connectedness where we transcend the limited self-concept in exchange for a broader, more interconnected and expanded sense of self. Which then, if I could, in case we were to miss it, coming back to Henny's question, from that perspective, we're able to have a clear intent. We can choose more consciously to focus on the meaningful goals that are worth pursuing in our life and looking around in the world today, the meaningful goals that are useful for all of us to benefit from in the world.
Thank you. And just reflecting a little more on the question, I wonder about the point that is raised there about fear, because the question says in the midst of collective and media-induced fear, and there's an interesting aspect to the question there, because I think the virus is real. The pandemic, in that sense, is real, but the way in which we are confronting the ramifications of the pandemic may not be so real. I mean, that's a question of what is being constructed and put in place in relation to what is real, i.e. a tiny biological entity. And so that point about, induced fear, I think, is interesting. And the point about fear, it's not pleasant. Obviously, we don't want to be afraid. But it's always seemed to me there are two levels of fear. One, where you're afraid of something, and in some ways it's not that dramatic. But when confronted with something really acute, you're slipping on the edge of the cliff, or goodness what, we all have some kind of example from our life histories, I'm sure. When that moment of real fear grabs you, it seems to me that something changes in that moment. And I won't say more because I'm just kind of trying to get dialogue here. But I think that point about, what changes in the moment. And so just linking it to the question, I wonder, because you're talking about open awareness, and again, I'm sure in a few minutes we'll come to that, and maybe you can help us with some practical sides of that as well, which would be great. But I think it is interesting just to stay with us a little bit that fear is not a great thing, and if the media are whipping it up, we don't want that. And at the same time, I think in a collective sense, maybe that kind of immediacy and the sense of collective change might come about through that level of fear. I don't know. Just thoughts.
Well, continuing from there, fear is an important mechanism that's gotten us to where we are today, just as any stress has. Because we've learned to cope with tremendous amounts of stress and fear. And it's for that purpose that we have this tunnel mode of perception built into us. And we've all heard about the fight and flight response. That's when our attention becomes narrowly fixated on that slip on the edge of the cliff, as you refer to it. And we immediately find ourselves in tunnel awareness, reacting with precision in just the right way so that we can survive this terrible incident. Usually, that takes a matter of seconds or minutes, and then we've overcome the immediate danger. What animals in the wild do is they go and shake it all off, and within a minute, they're grazing. Why don't we as humans do that? Why do we keep overthinking and arguing with our realities and turning something that is over with into suffering? And so without being aware of the mental, emotional, behavioral cycle that's going on and how that's being nurtured by media and by others and by collective fear, we're reasonably hopeless because we remain largely stuck in that tunnel mode of awareness. And that's exactly why the practice of open awareness has value today.
I understand. And just very briefly, I would say that most fear is like that, and we go into the tunnel awareness mode, the narrow mode. But in my experience, some very rare occasions when, when it was really serious and I was really gripped, in that moment, something opened up wider. But I'm not going to dwell on that because I want to give you the opportunity to say a little more about open awareness, or maybe to lead us in some kind of practice. Because just to talk about it is one thing, but obviously I know from knowing you that we're talking about something that's very, very practically oriented. So with that lead in, I pass over to you. Okay.
Great. Well, we're talking about this knee-jerk reaction when we're in the fear mode, stress mode. And, in that knee-jerk reaction, there is no space to think or behave consciously. Viktor Frankl was credited for the quote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In this space lies our freedom and our power to choose how we want to respond." It's in this space that our freedom and power lies. But when we're in that knee-jerk tunnel awareness mode, this space is not there. It becomes shrunken into that tunnel mode. Knee-jerk reaction, stimulus and response, they're rubbing up against each other. They're creating friction, and we fight and we run and we keep fighting and we keep running. We don't even know what we're fighting against or running from anymore, but we find ourselves trapped in this vicious cycle of negative thoughts, unresourceful feelings, reactional behaviors, feedback from others about what we're doing wrong. And so people can carry on in this way and they'll burn out eventually. But if we can do the practice now, and I'm going to invite you all to join me. Here we are. I'm not saying namaste. We're going to look at our fingers because we want to learn how to separate stimulus from response. And that's what the following exercise is all about. So if you bring your fingers together and look upon those fingers now, and keep your eyes on those fingers of the left hand and the right hand. Breathe in through the nose as you keep looking at those fingers. And as you breathe out, blow in between the hands, blow through the hands. And with a long, slow exhalation from your mouth, allow those hands to part and keep identifying those fingers. You're looking forward at your screen now, and keep seeing those fingers with that long, slow exhalation from the mouth. And as you breathe in through the nose, the fingers bring awareness back into its fixated mode. And breathe out from the mouth, blow between the hands, keep exhaling slowly as those hands go wider, drawing awareness wide. We're exercising our awareness muscles here. In through the nose as the hands come together. Blow them open with a long, slow exhalation and keep tracking those fingertips as they pull awareness wide into the periphery. And when you've gone as far as you can go, let the hands rest down by your lap again. And now just do that mentally one more time. And blow the hands apart. And as you blow them apart now, keep blowing with that long, slow exhalation. And imagine those hands going further than they went before. Come back to your next inhalation through the nose. Hands centered in your mind. Exhale from the mouth with that long, slow exhaling breath. Imagine awareness can go all the way around you, not just to where the hands were before, but all the way around you, encircling yourself in awareness with the out breath. Breathe in, imagine awareness coming back to in front of you. Out from the mouth and cocoon yourself in that surrounding awareness now. Embrace yourself in a field of awareness. And continue breathing normally, whichever way you'd like, and your eyes can be open or closed. I like to keep mine open because I'd like to calibrate everything that's going on. And as I'm breathing now, I'm starting to have a surrounding field of awareness that I can identify. And within this field of awareness, you can become aware of the entire volume of space that your whole body occupies. Become aware of the entire volume of space that your whole body occupies. And within this space, you can be aware of the breaths as they come and go. And you can notice in particular the space out of which your inhalations arise and the space into which your exhalations return. And notice the space out of which thoughts arise and the space into which your thoughts again return. And notice the space in which your whole sense of self is experienced. And just take a few more seconds to notice what you notice, about the way you feel right now. And then return to the breath, feeling the sensations of the breath again as they flow through you. Feel your connection to the ground. Take one more deep, full breath in. Let it all out. We're done with that one. And so that there is a little open awareness exercise, one that we could apply anywhere, anytime, quite discreetly in any situation, to start to bring about a sense of open awareness. At this point, I'd be curious about any sharings with regard to what you have experienced. What's it like for you, this open awareness? Was it any different from the state you were in a few minutes ago? Any characteristics of your experience that you're noticing that you could share in the chat window? Perhaps it's just a subtle difference that you might feel in your body, notice in the mind. Maybe it's something like an attitude change towards something in your life. Maybe it's even more present or still. Entirely dropping the ballast, breaking the circle of obsessive thoughts and feelings. Allows an orientation with calm, whole self-awareness. The big questions that stay with me now is how can you touch into this expansive awareness in larger connected ways? You seem very good at speaking to cultivate connected care. Yes, Jessica, that's great. I would love to address. Spiritual sense of expansion, just relaxation, diffuse softness. Diffuse is an important word, comes up a lot in the practice. Rachel, you felt like you could reach out and touch the people on the screen. Now that's actually very important. I'd love to say something to that too. And might it be that the sense of distance between people changed? Hello, Nelly, the gentle state of peace. Thank you. The sense of your spatial awareness toward others, toward objects, people and things, and the world around you shifts in some way. And as I ask that question, anyone can try it on. And I'd like to come to Jessica's inquiry here. How could this type of open awareness practice be cultivated by groups? And this is something I've been exploring a lot lately. In fact, it was only this year that I launched the Open Awareness for Change project. And actually that launch date was literally a couple of days before all the big announcements of COVID-19 arose. So it seemed like an idea that wanted to come into the world at that time. And it advocates a practice that's done by groups, whether online or physically in the same room. This speaks to Rachel's experience, where we come together figuratively into a sharing circle in a circular format. And we imagine taking our place, being seated, and we start to breathe with that in and out breath together. And we start to cultivate a shared participatory space in which we feel we can reach out and touch each other. And through that, there seems to be a tapping into the group's collective consciousness, and the group itself tapping into an even more expansive consciousness, which seems to be infinitive. And that intent of the group to come into this shared space, to co-create it, is one of our transpersonal coaching techniques that we would use to work with groups to help them access more creative levels of thought, problem solving, and doing so in a way that transcends the individual egos in the group or even the group's collective ego, and going beyond their normal ways of thinking and processing in order to tap into that greater whole. And then to, as the process continues, draw from that collective consciousness pertinent ideas that aim to address specific issues that that group has come together for. So there's very practical utility to this in that regard.
Jevon, if I may come in there. As you're speaking, what comes to my mind is some of the work that's being done, for example, by Otto Scharmer and colleagues at the Presencing Institute. I happen to have one of Otto Scharmer's books on my table. Otto Scharmer and Katrin Käufer wrote this book called Leading from the Emerging Future. And the system that Otto Scharmer and colleagues have developed it resonates a lot with what you're describing, the deeper attunement through an awareness-based practice, almost like a descending movement and an opening, noticing what wants to arise from this deeper space, what wants to arise perhaps from what we might call source, or you may have a different word for it. One thing that I'm sitting with as I'm exploring that kind of work is how we can engage in that kind of work with people who are maybe not quite so on our wavelength. You know, in circles like this, and certainly also the circles I've seen in the Presencing Institute, I think many people come together who are already like-minded, who are resonating with these ideas of open awareness, meditation, mindfulness-based practices. But there are so many people out there who probably are quite adverse to these principles and or not familiar with them, or haven't experienced them. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, how we can engage people who are new to those ways of working, who maybe have only experienced the cultivation of division, of needing to fight your place in the world, for your place in the world, the kind of more argumentative, discursive place where you battle it out. How do we engage with people who are not on our wavelength?
Yes, and that's such an important consideration, Jessica. Thanks for asking. And I have to say to that the open awareness technique is very pragmatic and has utility in every context that I can think of, and is not a meditative practice or even a mindfulness-based practice per se. It's kind of distinct because it identifies the value of the space that we share. And it's very easy, especially with the pandemic that's going on, to highlight how we are all interconnected. Everybody can relate to that, to the pandemic. But we can have another quality of experience of that. And if somebody is, let's say, not open-minded, although I always believe the potential for it exists, and they've come to me as a client, and they're having an issue with a person or with a group of people, and then I want to talk about the fluffy stuff, no abstract terminology. They're very in the head and logical and linear in their thinking. I might say, look, if you continue approaching the situation in the ways that you always have, you'll probably always get those types of results. And if you want a different result, let's try something different, right? And for the sake of keeping it simple, how about instead of focusing on what it is, and we'll identify the trigger. The trigger of the problem is the tone in somebody's voice, or the look in her eye, for example, or the attitude of that group or that government, or whatever the case may be. As soon as we identify the trigger of what is getting us feeling unpleasant, then start to focus on the space between you and that person or that group. Drop the look in their eyes, the tone in their voice, and whatever it is that they're doing. In exchange for focusing on the space, literally the space between you and them. Then we experience, as was identified earlier, that diffused state. It's no longer glaring eyes coming at me, a tone in the voice that wants to attack me, or their behaviors that I will not accept and will only judge negatively, but by becoming more sensitive to the space between oneself and others, we experience those others distinctly differently. And then we find a new range of responses that weren't available to us just through that subtle shift in awareness. with younger clients or playful clients, I'll sometimes say, as you're telling me about the problem, keep these fingers here in your periphery and keep seeing those fingers in your periphery while you talk about the problem. And they find that they cannot identify the problem in the same way. So simple little skills, take a few breaths, feel your whole body, and now think about the problem, rather than always addressing the issue in the same ways. It was Einstein himself who said, we can't deal with the problems that we're facing in the same level of thinking as that with which we created those problems. We need a new level of thinking. Now, I'm not talking about escalating or higher up types of levels of thinking, but more expansive and inclusive ways of experiencing oneself in relation to others. And these are simple. They are simple skills. And I hope that through these skills they'll become accessible and appealing to people that might not ordinarily take an interest in meditation or other spiritual practices. And with that said, I don't want to undermine the potency of these skills to really have a transformative value on the person, because we can go beyond the simple skills to more full, rich experiences of open awareness that can be quite profound.
Thank you for that, Jevon. And as you're speaking, what comes to my mind there is exactly I'm thinking and reflecting on how do I cope with moments of stress, moments of conflict, you know, in a family life or, you know, with colleagues, you know, moments of tension. And if I think about how I work with them, it often involves the shift of perspective through physical engagement. I'm also picking up on what Vitaly has written in the chat window. He mentions art, music, you know, being engaged creatively. That certainly also really resonates with me. That when we're in those moments of tension and conflict, as you say, there's this sort of narrowing down, and it feels quite tense in the body, right? And quite shallow in certain ways, and maybe it's located in some parts of the body that are tightening up. And how do I shift out of that? Well, by shifting the body, quite literally, moving. You know, dancing is one way that I liberate the body. I trained as an actress, again, using the theatrical arts as a way to shift perspective and to soften my stance. It works beautifully. You know, when you're an actor, what you're doing is embodying somebody else's perspective. You're learning to switch perspective. It's a really useful tool that anyone can avail themselves of. And it's very easily done by shifting the body, shifting perspective, just slightly shifting, softening, moving from that place that hardened up into a softer place, a slightly different angle. As soon as you're shifting in that way, you're psychophysically shifting perspective, you're changing the space. And it's that sort of more playful, more soft, fluid engagement that can then help us all to come into a different relationship with what we perceived as the problem, right?
Yes, that's beautiful. And you know, to what you and Vitaly have shared here, these practices are worth so much. But to that, I'd like to add that these are practices one needs to adhere to on a regular basis. And in that way, to something else that Henny has referred to earlier in the chat again, we start to take a resourceful state and we embody it into a new trait, a new mode of being in a specific context. And that's a big deal in our transpersonal coaching approach at Out of Trust. It's all about helping the client on their terms to access the optimal way in which they can get to a state of open awareness. And once we've established that with the client, then we will, with them in the session, prescribe a practice, engage in the practice with them, and get their commitment to stick to that practice for as long as it takes until it becomes an embodied new way of being. The state becomes a trait through repetition. And that's important. Now, once again, the simplicity of the open awareness technique and all the skills that are part of that have value in these different contexts. And I spoke about these three areas that open awareness makes us more aware of self, others, and the environment that connects us. But as we practice open awareness, and this has come to me through my own practice of what I refer to as JUMI, which is an acronym for Judo Mind. And I've been developing this practice over the past 20 years, and it's designed specifically to help people to embody the state of open awareness. As we develop this kind of spatial awareness, we start to identify specific characteristics in the spaces that surround us. For example, quite logically, I guess, in front of us is the future, behind us is the past. Below us is the earth and its energy. Above us is the universe, the cosmos, the infinite unknown. To our left is the feminine aspect or yin energy. To our right is the masculine yang energy. And that seems to be somewhat universal. As we practice open awareness, the technique which I'm referring to, these 7 aspects of the self. No, there's no research to validate the 7 aspects of self, but I do hope to explore it further. This has occurred to me through my practice that as we enrich awareness of these 7 sides or aspects of the self, we become more integrated as human beings, and thereby we become more fully functional. Our thinking is automatically win-win-win in all circumstances. Even when we find our awareness going into fixated mode because it's an urgent, critical situation, the choices we make are, according to what Frankl was quoted for, freeing and empowering, and they're win-win-win. And that's interesting to observe. And, these have been the observations of the transpersonal coaching students and practitioners that I work with over quite a few years now.
I'd like to invite in our participants in this session at this point, Jevon, and perhaps we could explore together, reflect for a moment. How have you coped with those moments of stress or tension? What ways are accessible to you? How do you personally make sense of a kind of open awareness practice? What is that for you? How is that embodied for you? And I'd like to invite you to post in the chat window, and equally also if there are questions still around the practices that we're exploring, what they mean individually and collectively, please post them as well. As you're writing and as you're processing that thinking, I'd like to also add that I think we all have different ways of making sense of these techniques, for want of a better word, approaches, pathways. We have different ways to make sense of them and to enact them. So some of us are more movement-based, more kinesthetically oriented. Some of us are more audio-oriented. Some of us are very much oriented towards inner sensing, proprioception. And it's useful for us to notice that. Where is, through which channels do impulses come? Where do we perceive? On what levels do we perceive as we are in complex dynamics and relationships? So this kind of inner attunement to the channels that are available to us is really useful. But going back to my question, how do you make sense? Share a little bit in the chat window. How do you make sense of open awareness practice? What is it for you? How does it manifest for you? And are there questions still that you'd like us to explore in the last few minutes that we're together today? I've got my eyes trained on that chat window.
While we're waiting for any other comments to come in the chat window, just reflecting on one thing which I'd like to share, which is the connection to consciously working in a ritual way. I think that, Jevon, when you were talking about the space, how we how we are conscious of the space and expanding our sense of space. It reminds me of work that I've done with ritual. I don't just mean on a sort of automatic way, but with certain intentions and, as it were, conscious. And I think in that framework, you know, the way the space changes has always seemed really important to me. And I think it's very interesting what you're describing. I mean, I've done work with, you know, open awareness as well. And, you know, it puts the lie to this sense of separateness. Because as my sense of the space changes, I know from experience that others also change in that way. There is something a little bit beyond just the individual sense of space. And that is, you know, where we share collectively. Just thought I'd just say I was wondering if others would want to put into the chat window. So I'll step back at that point. I just wanted to point out that interesting to me comparison.
Thank you, Les. And just now, actually, a couple of messages have come up in the chat window, and thank you to Vitali and Kai for posting. So let's take a moment to absorb this. So Vitali writes that music is his life buoy, and you don't turn to it so often, but why not? But when the state is very tense, dissatisfied, difficult to deal with, I just take a flute or a drum and start making music. I'm just thinking that Stephen Schmitz is in the room as well, who of course utilizes drumming quite extensively in shamanic practice. So yes, when we utilize music making, it's a wonderful way to shift, right? To shift one state of awareness. Yeah. Start making music, says Vitali, and a kind of ritual with all the strength and depth. And the world around me starts to dance and sound too. It's hard to describe. Thank you for sharing that. And Kai writes, practicing open awareness can allow an orientation of whole self within the wider whole, accessing the space between the self and the collective. And this allows us to access our sovereignty as individuals, the whole self, not only beyond limitations, but expanding into the space around the self and within that whole. I'm trying to feel my way into that, Kai, as you're writing that and expressing it, and transport it back into a theatre session where we were working very internally and exploring these ideas around, you know, concepts really of self and other and the whole of the performance ensemble. And yes, they were mental concepts, but they were also experiential. And we were feeling the spaces between each other and the spaces within. Sometimes I had my eyes closed and I could feel both the collective and myself within the collective, and I could experience myself from the perspective of the other. And it's wonderful when you engage in these practices how a fluidity occurs where you're no longer so self-identified as in ego-identified, and you become so expansive and you can look back at yourself. It's hard to describe, but it's certainly really wonderful to explore these practices in groups. So it's not just, you know, for me, myself, my kind of straw to the gods, I'm sucking down the nectar, right? But I'm connecting with others in this practice. And it feels so vital to do that today, whilst we're in such a state of collective fear, despair, you know, rising hysteria. Wow, big questions. I'm looking at the time and it's 8 o'clock here in the UK. This hour seems to have flown by, and I feel there are some really juicy topics still that we could be tapping together. Jevon, are there some closing words that you'd like to say before we close the session together?
Well, thank you, Jessica. Both you and Les have summed up my intention for this evening's talk very beautifully, which I might then bring to one phrase, which is the intention that we hold in transpersonal coaching, which is to hold the liminal space, to be that space, and to encapsulate others and the world in that enlarged experience of self. And in so doing, to feel a greater sense of empathy and compassion to self and other. And when it gets full and deep, the idea of self and other even becomes obsolete. There's just presence. And that presence is what open awareness practice brings about. And I think that presence is what we can all make an effort to bring about more of in the world today.
Here, here, Jevon. Let us all work on that, to cultivate that presence with ourselves and with others, realizing that the other is really also within the self. We're all one. Thank you all for taking the time to join this session today. Francesca, if we could just bring up the closing slide, thank you. We'd like to invite you to join us in our last session. That's happening on the 4th of October with Les and myself. We'll be exploring myth and the sort of deeper narratives that have been unfolding and competing and fueling our present times. So we'll be diving into the power of myth together. And if you'd like to join us, please just visit our website and you can register there. I'd like to thank you for your engagement today. It's been fascinating to unpack this topic with you, and I really appreciate everything that you've brought into the dialogue today. And again, thank you to Jevon for sharing your practices. I wish you all well. Feel free to unmute yourselves to say goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.